we're asked to find the domain of the function. And our rule is going to be the domain is all real numbers for which that particular function is defined. So when we look at this first example, f of x equals 1 over x plus 5, we have a rational function, a function in the form of a fraction, and what we know is that division by 0 is not possible. So therefore, the denominator of this fraction cannot be equal to 0. So we're going to write x plus 5 cannot equal 0, which means that x cannot be negative 5. That means our domain, what would be implied for this problem is that the domain is all real numbers except for negative 5. So the mathematical way to write that down is to use interval notation, negative infinity to negative 5, jump over the negative 5, and then we're going to go from negative 5 to infinity. So this is the domain for that function written in interval notation. Note that we used parentheses with the negative 5 because the negative 5 was not included in the domain, and it's also standard notation that we always use a parentheses when we use infinity. The next example says that g of x is equal to the square root of 4 minus 3x. For this particular function, the implied domain would be we cannot take the square root of a negative number. So therefore, our 4 minus 3x would have to be greater than or equal to 0, which means 4 is greater than or equal to 3x, and 4/3 is greater than or equal to x. Or another way to write that would be x is less than or equal to 4/3. So it's all real numbers that are less than or equal to 4/3. So the way we would write that in interval notation, again, we would start at negative infinity and go up to all the numbers to 4/3, including 4/3. So we're going to use a bracket to indicate that the 4/3 is included in the domain. The last example is the volume of a sphere. V equals 4/3 pi r cubed. Now we don't have any restrictions on this particular function like we did for the rational function or the square root function. But the restriction that we have on this problem is that it's a real-life problem. We're trying to find the volume of a sphere. It would not make sense to say you had a sphere that had a radius of 0 or a radius of negative 5. A radius of a sphere cannot be a negative number. So therefore, our domain is going to be that r has to be greater than 0 for this to make sense and that formula to actually represent a sphere. So if we want to write that in interval notation, we would start at 0, not including 0, so we use a parentheses, and then we're going to infinity.